As she said, my name is Chris Johnson. I'm the music director at Classical 89.5, and I feel like in this particular audience, I should probably just ask out front so I know what I'm dealing with here. How many of you in this room knew Austin had a classical radio station? Okay, good. All right, this makes me feel a lot better. I also do some writing on the side for a magazine called Arts and Culture, which publishes statewide and online. And I primarily write about music, obviously. And my editor, when I send her the first draft of just about any piece, particularly reviews where I'm talking about a performance, she will frequently send it back. And every other highlighted portion of the places she wants me to make edits or amendments or whatever, she'll say, "Can you nerd it up just a little bit here?" But I have to try really hard to do that because in radio, you're trained, it's built into me to be able to try and talk about what I do to the most general of audiences. So as I was sitting around thinking about what I was going to talk about tonight, this is what I had in mind. And then, of course, I walk into this room and I hear the first talk and I'm thinking, all I can see in front of me is red, nerd it up, nerd it up. So I'm going to try and nerd up my talk a little more than what I had planned to. And we've been talking about it on the radio for the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about this event, and the copy I read is something like, Chris Johnson is going to give a talk about the surprising connections between astronomy, the stars, outer space, and classical music. And the whole time I'm saying this, I'm thinking, well, the surprise for me was that there was a connection. There was a person who came to me in my office, and they were like, this often happens to me in my line of work, by the way. Somebody comes up and they're like, "Hey, we'd like you to go do a talk at this thing." And I eventually say, "Well, what kind of thing is that?" And so anyway, so we start. So I did what people in the media frequently do, people in radio at least, which was I went to Facebook and I said, "Hey, y'all, I've got to give a talk about classical music and something about astronomy. Any suggestions would be appreciated." And I'm very proud to say that, within 24 hours, my Facebook page, which you can find at CJ Classic DJ, by the way, became from what I can tell, the most exhaustive and thorough catalog of every random connection you could possibly make between astronomy, space, the moon, anything you can imagine. Some of them were very general and very, very kind of silly and very elementary, and some of them quite literally blew my mind. So I'm going to try and share some of all of that with you tonight. I work in sound, so I don't have pictures, but I did bring some musical examples, and we'll try and work our way through this as I go. So, and I feel like in terms of fun facts, the one that I want to share is about being like how I don't belong here. My only qualification to talk about astronomy is I did get my astronomy merit badge when I was in the Boy Scouts. But that also I spent most of my time in school, walking around saying, "I'm a musician. I don't need to know that stuff." So I was in fact dropped from my college algebra class more than once. But it all worked out in the end. So, and if you talk in terms of time, another thing that's been amazing to sit here and listen, especially just a few minutes ago, where you start talking about time in terms of billions and billions of years, music in some form or fashion has existed as long as people have been looking up at the stars. From the point where somebody could vocalize, you have music. In the early days, I would imagine in the plains of Africa, they started to fashion bows, which, hundreds of years later became things that I would use to play my violin. But those were essentially sort of the proto-musical instruments. But I deal specifically in my line of work with what they call Western classical music, which has really only been around for about the last 500 years or so. And if you add to that in the beginning, most of that classical music existed solely in the church. Stars were kind of a forbidden subject, as you could imagine. So it wasn't until, I would say, probably the 18th century, from what I could see, where you literally start to see any kind of direct influences. The earliest example that I'll share with you tonight is from an opera by Joseph Haydn. So Joseph Haydn was the guy who essentially invented the symphony. He invented the string quartet, you know, as a genre. He's not somebody who's often associated with opera, but one of his operas, from what I could see, one of the ones that people talk about the most and still perform the most, happens to be called, it is called Il Mondo della Luna, the world on the moon. This is and I realize the moon's not a star, but you know, we're artists, so you got to give me some leeway here. So it turns out the story that he set, the libretto, the book, the lyrics that he used for this particular opera had been set to music at least 6 other times before he got to it. And it is a genre of opera that the Italians called opera buffa, which is essentially a farcical kind of a comedy. Buffa, kind of like buffoon. The opera buffas usually involved as their main antagonist a very rich, often very fat man. And in this case, the very wealthy fat guy was a guy named Buenafeda, who had 2 daughters and their maid, and they were all 3 in love. He was not happy with the men that they were in love with because they were essentially poor. They weren't so well off. So he was like plotting for them not to marry these guys. And one of the boyfriends, as it turns out, was a bit of a charlatan astrologer. So in the opening scene of this opera, we find ourselves in an observatory with his students. And I'm hoping this is going to play. So usually in opera, at this point, you've had a big loud overture. People have come in, you know, are still coming into their seats. At the point the overture stops, you usually get something like this. It's a little more lyric, a little more quiet. And he's in his astronomy, and he's got his students, his, what do you call them, PhD, like his assistants, you know, his TAs or whatever. And they sing a song to the moon. So this is the setup for this piece. What ultimately happens is our charlatan astrologer devises this great plan where he's going to trick Buenafede, our rich, old, fat, funny guy, by way of drugging him. And he recreates in his garden the moon. So he like drugs the guy and like fakes like we've suddenly gone to the moon. Exactly. So while they're on the moon, Buenafede in his drugged out state is like totally entranced by everything that's going on. People are speaking some made up foreign language, some lunatic tongue, I guess you would call it. And eventually they trick him into marrying off his daughters to the men that they actually love. And of course, by the time he like becomes undrugged and wakes up from the circumstance, he doesn't realize what's happened. And then eventually he does realize what's happened. And they sing a song about how, what does he say? It's better, you know, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved, or something like that. So this is from Il Mondo della Luna, The World on the Moon, by Joseph Haydn. So about the same time as Haydn, there was a guy who y'all might know more about than I do. His name was William Herschel. People know who William Herschel was. Why? And he discovered, exactly. So, did you know he was also a composer? Yes. Yeah, okay, good. So, he was a rather prolific composer, as it turns out. This is the kind of music we would play on the radio, but I can't say that I spent a lot of time talking about Herschel for the most part. But I was so happy to have discovered this. He wrote 24 symphonies, which is a lot, I guess, in his spare time. Same time as Haydn. So same kind of thing. This is 18th century. This is what they call the classical era, which I guess is pretty universal. This is actually a really great discovery for me. I kind of like this piece. So he wrote 24 symphonies. He also played the violin. I play the violin, so that always makes me proud. He played the oboe. His dad was an oboist. He apparently started off life playing in a band. He was a band geek before he was an astronomy geek. 24 concertos, 24 symphonies, a bunch of concertos. He played the harpsichord and the organ as well. And as you can hear, this ethereal orchestration, perhaps something that might evoke a starlit sky at night. Okay, that was a bit of a reach. So, in the 19th century, in the Romantic era, artists in particular were not so concerned with science, but they fell in love with the moon. And it became like a literary and musical trope. And it shows up over and over and over again throughout classical music. Some famous examples are this one. Does anybody know this? The Moonlight Sonata, right, exactly. So that's probably a very popular example. You could spend a whole hour going through examples of this whole idea of some, usually suicidal poet type standing under a tree in the moonlight, complaining about the fact that the woman he's in love with does not, in fact, love him. And he may or may not commit suicide at the end of that story. Another example, as you get a little closer to the 20th century, also really well known. Yeah, exactly. And again, you could probably spend a whole hour talking about all of the various versions of this song, this Clair de Lune, this, I forget what it translates to, but by the light of the moon or something. And this is the most famous of them, but there are so many of them. This is somehow the one that just stuck. And you hear it played on piano, you hear it played with an orchestra, with just a violin, like any instrument that can make music has probably played this particular piece at one time or another. I was super excited. Side note, did anybody go see the Star Wars marathon on Saturday at the Long Center? Yeah, I was there. I was a late convert to the Star Wars series, even though that was from my generation for sure. But it seems to have the 97 sort of digital upgrades or whatever seem to have had a bigger impact on culture for like the millennial generation than even those of us who were alive in the 70s and 80s. But John Williams wrote the score for that music, famously so. It is because of him that many people who are working and being very successful in the field of classical music are doing what they do. In fact, I happen to have a good friend who is a conductor. He is the assistant conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra, considered to be one of the best orchestras in the world, and he will tell you all day long about why Star Wars and John Williams are the reason he became a conductor. John Williams was also is also famous for ripping off in a very artistic, in a very skilled way, any number of composers through history, least of which is the guy who wrote the intro music for Astronomy on Tap. Gustav Holst. Does everybody know this one? Okay, yes, this is from the planets. So he wrote this 7-movement suite, and which is really, again, it's less about astronomy, more about astrology, because he had in mind, the astrological aspect of this, the sort of the Greek gods that we associate with the planets, less so than the stars. That said, Pluto was discovered in his lifetime, and it was about 4 years before he died when they finally discovered Pluto. And I think it really irritated him that people kept coming to him, asking him, "Are you going to write music for Pluto?" He was a little pissed off that this piece was so successful. This is an idea you see a lot in classical music, that the pieces that we know that are the most famous pieces by certain composers were the ones that they liked the least, or that they felt in some way like, were surprised at least by the fact that these pieces became so popular. So the planets were like that for Gustav Holst. It really irritated him when people asked him, "Are you going to write music for Pluto?" So somebody else did. I think it was about 1950 when a British guy composed music to accompany Gustav Holst's original planets. I won't play that for you tonight. So there you go. Now, as you get into the more recent times, the late 20th, the early 21st century, you start to see more direct references, also weirder ones as well. There was a French composer whose name was Olivier Messiaen, who lived, let's say, mid-20th century. He was fascinated with all things to do with nature, with rocks, with birds. He wrote a series of pieces where he would try to imitate in music bird calls. And interestingly, he was commissioned to write music for the American Bicentennial. This French guy, go figure, was commissioned to write music by Alice Tully, who's a famous patron of the art in New York, the person they named Alice Tully Hall for at Lincoln Center. He was commissioned to write music for the American Bicentennial, and so while he was traveling and like sort of ruminating on what he was going to do, he found himself in Colorado at Bryce Canyon, fascinated by the stars, and he wrote a piece called "The Canyon of the Stars." One of the movements, he wrote a horn call that was supposed to sound all the way to outer space. And if you ask me, it sounds more like outer space than anything else that we've heard so far. Hold on. There we go. So this is definitely not something we would play on the radio. Supposed to sound all the way out of the earth. John Cage was another person who, so he wrote what they called, he wrote music by what he called chance operations. So you were as likely to see John Cage playing a game of chess or rolling a dice to figure out what notes he was going to use in his next piece. He's probably most famous for his piece called 433. You people know that one? So it's notorious because usually what happens is a pianist, although he says any instrument or any combination of instruments can perform this piece, comes out on stage, sits down at the piano, and proceeds to sit there in silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The analog and visual arts would be Robert Rauschberg, if you know paintings. He was the guy that did the white canvas. So yes, the all-white canvas. I know it sounds so funny when you say it like that. So John Cage wrote a piece of music, and I really can't tell you what the process was, but he used a map of the stars as like the basis for the pitches that he would use in a set of piano pieces, which he called Etude Austral. And again, not something we play on the radio. So there's a little of that. This is the kind of thing, if I put this on the radio, like the phone would start blowing up with lots of very angry people. So there were some other things, and for this I want to look to my notes here, because as I said, I crowdsourced this whole thing and I was completely fascinated by some of the stuff that came back to me. One other example, there was a Polish composer who died in like the early 1990s, I want to say, named Heinrich Gorecki. He was commissioned to write music for the 500th birthday anniversary of Copernicus. So there is his Symphony No. 2, the Copernican. I discovered, and y'all might be able to tell me more about this, in 2003, the New York Times published an article which the headline read, "Music of the Heavens turns out to sound a lot like B-flat." Wherein we learn that, quote, astronomers say they've heard the sound of a black hole singing. And what it is singing, and perhaps has been singing for more than 2 billion years, they say, is B-flat. That's B-flat, 57 octaves lower than middle C on the piano. I'm not going to try and talk to you about what exactly is causing those pitches, although I'm sure somebody here could tell me all about it. But I posted a link to the article on our website at kmfa.org. There's a whole Reddit thread devoted to this whole topic that we're exploring tonight, so I linked to that on our website as well. I found out that as of 4 days ago, this unfortunate Kickstarter campaign ended, although I don't think it's the end of the story. But there is a composer who is working in collaboration with an astrophysicist on something called the Hubble Cantata. On their Kickstarter page, they claim that the project will be, quote, the first multi-dimensional view into space, using images from the Hubble telescope paired with the live performances, opening the world of virtual reality to 6,000 people for free. I'm not sure how they came up with the number 6,000. And then last of all, the music that inspired the name for this talk by an American composer named Aaron J. Kernis, which he calls Musica Celestis, or celestial music. And this is actually gorgeous. Which I feel like could accompany any one of the images that we saw tonight. And I don't think there's a direct astronomical reference here, but more something about music inspired by the heavens. Pulitzer Prize winner, if I'm not mistaken. His name is Aaron J. Kernis. So that is Musica Celestis, or celestial music. And like I said, there's a lot of information that I discovered, which I link to all. I put this all up on our website because that's what we do in the media. So if you want to learn more about anything that I've talked about, it's available on our website at KMFA.org. You can also find this rather mammoth thread where I was crowdsourcing stuff. And really, I should have said, like, who recommended what on this talk tonight, because some of the recommendations came from my friend Steve Smith, who's the music editor of the Boston Globe. One of them was from Nico Muhly, who is a guy The Guardian described as the hottest classical composer on the planet. They were talking about his music, and he's kind of good looking. He was actually here in Austin last year. He did a big premiere, but so anyway, you know, all of this came from the best of the best in the world of classical music, and I thank you guys and the folks at Astronomy on Tap for letting me come share it.